Snufkin is a side character in Moomin, the beloved children's book series and animated show. He serves as a platonic love interest to the titular main character, Moomin. One of the things most often noted about Snufkin is his deep dislike of authority figures, to the point that he is often described as an anarchist. As someone who has grown to call themselves an anarchist, I was intrigued by whether or not this actually held up in practice. But after searching online, I wasn't able to find a satisfying answer, and so I thought I would take a look at it myself. Before trying to establish if Snufkin is an anarchist, I think we should make sure we have a rough idea of what anarchism actually is. Anarchism is the libertarian branch of socialism. Socialism, as an ideology, sees inequality as being caused by inherently unjust and unequal power dynamics, mainly in the workplace. As such, socialism strives to abolish these unjust power dynamics by instating democratic processes into both the state and place of labor. The things that differ different socialist branches is how this is supposed to be achieved. Statist socialists, so communists, Marxists, democratic socialists, etc., view the state as a tool that can be used to oppress but also liberate the working class. Anarchists, on the other hand, view the state as an inherently oppressive structure that can only serve to reproduce and facilitate oppression, and thus advocate for its abolition. Communists also want to abolish the state in the long run, but they believe in a transitional period where the state will be maintained to help construct true communism. Anarchism is often confused for a lack of organization, when in reality it is non-hierarchical organization. So instead of a boss or a party leader deciding what happens, the decisions are instead made by the people who will be affected by it. Anarchist theory places great emphasis on direct action, mutual aid, and the idea that the ends is the means, or that we can only build a free society with free means. Of course, both socialism and anarchism specifically are much more complicated than the way I just portrayed them. I'm going to throw some links in the description in case you're interested in further readings. Most of them are going to be videos. As Moomin is a show directed at children, you obviously can't expect Snufkin to suddenly come around the corner with Bakunin and Proudhorn and voluntary association and all of the things that actually make up anarchist philosophy as we know it. We might need to read between the lines at least a little bit, and here's what we'll be looking for. In his book Anarchy, the German author Horst Stohwasser introduces the concept of anarchisms, while examining if anarchism, anarchist thought, existed in history and pre-industrial societies. He defines anarchisms as such. We would do well not to view anarchism as an ideology, but rather a tendency that presents itself with specific key values. Freedom, hostility to domination, solidarity, mutual aid, autonomy of the individual, networks of small units, self-determination, and rebellion against foreign determination. He does this because searching for anarchism, or at least the key tenets of it as a political ideology, in a pre-industrial, pre-state world would be, in his own words, like looking for a pre-Christ Christianity. That is because anarchism is centered around opposing what it deems to be oppressive hierarchies, the state, the church, and the centralization of production, and trying to provide alternatives to those. Absent these hierarchies, it is difficult to identify a representation of the ideology as we know it. Despite the difficulties of finding anarchist thought in certain settings, it is undeniable that Snufkin possesses a certain libertarian quality, and that his characterization leans toward what most people would see as anarchist aligned. Therefore, I think that instead of asking ourselves the question, is Snufkin an anarchist, we should be asking ourselves, does Snufkin have the key values of an anarchist as defined by these anarchisms? Freedom. I think this point is the easiest to make, as freedom is one of the cornerstones of Snufkin as a character, and one of the biggest parts of his character is him leaving every winter and returning every spring, a thing you could hardly do if you were unfree in a physical, material, or emotional way. I also, however, think that freedom as a political adjective is always really, really vague and unhelpful, because everyone always wants freedom, but it's for whom and how this freedom is supposed to be achieved that actually matters. So this alone doesn't actually help the case for him being an anarchist. Rebellion against foreign determination. One of Snufkin's main stories is about him getting into a fight with the authoritarian parkkeeper. At the beginning of the book, the parkkeeper is established as Snufkin's one and only nemesis. Snufkin despises the park keeper and all the rules he has put in place, especially to do with the way the park space is managed and controlled. The aesthetics of the park upset Snufkin. Trimmed hedges, manicured plants, straight paths, and worst of all, fences, because it's an effort to control the people who want to enjoy the park and the beauty of nature itself. The park's rules are absurdly restrictive: no whistling, laughing, skipping, hopping, etc. A group of lost, orphaned children are allowed into the park each day, but under controlled conditions, allowed to play in the sandbox and nowhere else. On Midsummer's Eve, Snufkin sees this and decides to get revenge on the park keeper, scare him, and set the children free from this arrangement. He decides to sabotage the park keeper in a clever way. He plants Hattie-Fatten seeds, knowing that at night they will sprout and generate a huge army of the glowing creatures in the park, which would be bad enough, but they also have an electrical current in them that reacts with the park keeper's jacket's metal buttons, which makes them start to glow in the dark, which draws in the Hattie-Fatten, terrifying him and his wife and forcing him to flee the park. This is how Snufkin drives him out of the park, and then tears down the signs with all of the unnecessary rules that he doesn't like, so anyone can do what they want, come and go as they please, and the plants can grow naturally. He considers his work done and declares the children free, but unfortunately, the children don't know how to enjoy their freedom and act independently like Snufkin, and thus ask him to help them. So they follow him, expecting him to take care of them. The jockster, Snufkin's dad, at one point says the last he heard of his family was them being at war with the park keeper. Snufkin and his family are so opposed to someone else telling them and others what to do that they have an intergenerational feud going on with park keepers. Snufkin, on an intrinsic level, is opposed to other people inhibiting him, others, or nature in doing what they feel is best for themselves. A noteworthy addition is Snufkin Let's Go Fill Moomin Valley with Crime, a quote from Crooks in Moomin Valley, episode 41. The thing to note here, however, is that Snufkin is doing this to save a cop's job. They need to drive up crime statistics because the cop's boss is like, oh, there's no crime in Moomin Valley, so we don't need the officer, as if the police would ever voluntarily dial back police presence, which, kind of clashes with being anti-authority and an anarchist. This is a thing that a lot of people have pointed out. However, canonically, there's never any crime in Moomin Valley, which was said in the same episode, which kind of raises the question of what does the cop even do? Does he even have any repressive function? Because anarchists don't hate cops because that's what anarchists do. They oppose cops because of the oppressive and authoritarian nature of them, which seems to be absent in Moomin Valley's cops. However, it is more than abundant in the park keeper. The Moomins seem to live in some kind of post-scarcity society with no private property, which would remove the oppressive nature of the police, who exist to guard and protect private property, capital, and those who own it. The park keeper, on the other hand, is actually actively inhibiting the freedom of everyone in the park, the children, and Snufkin, and does so while using unjust rules and laws as a justification. Also, his uniform looks like a cop. That's not that important, but I just wanted to have it said. Solidarity and mutual aid. Solidarity in praxis can be a bit hard to nail down because it so heavily depends on the situation and the needs and abilities of the people in them. I tried to find examples of Snufkin doing a solidarity, but I really struggled because all I found were examples of Snufkin being nice that kind of lacked the intrinsically political aspect of solidarity. Because Moomin Valley is a post-scarcity society with no government, there isn't really like politics in the sense that we understand it. There are no oppressed groups, there are no people suffering from institutional oppression, there's no poverty, everybody has enough to eat, a place to sleep, all of those things. And so real world solidarity is solidarity because it is intrinsically political. But you can't really find examples of Snufkin doing that, I think, in Moomin Valley, or at least not like that. All you can find is him just being nice to other people, which seems really basic, but that's just kind of what solidarity is, taking the opportunity to help people whenever it arises. It's just that it kind of lacks the intrinsically political nature of solidarity, and so it was hard to find like concrete examples. And that's why I don't think that we should be looking for examples of Snufkin practicing solidarity, but instead the right question to ask is, would Snufkin help somebody in need? If Snufkin had the means to help somebody and somebody needed help, would he help that person even if he had no reason or profit from doing so? And I think the answer to that question is yes, he would. And a Redditor made a really good point about Snufkin, namely about how non-forced his assistance is. In their own words, I feel like Snufkin would often do things on his own to show how another option is possible, but he wouldn't necessarily convince other people to cooperate with him. That way, his aid is kind of indirect and very non-forced. And I think that that's a very accurate observation, and that idea, and the way that Snufkin does this, has strong parallels with the most basic tenets of mutual aid, namely the unconditional and voluntary support of others, as opposed to traditional charities who often have conditions for accessing their help. Other than that, the concept of mutual aid doesn't really apply to Snufkin, because mutual aid is more of an organizational model, and Snufkin is but one man. Autonomy of the individual. I think the case for Snufkin and autonomy of the individual is similar to a similar one to Snufkin and freedom, but there's also what he does when he frees those children from the park. After he frees them, they start following him around, saying that they don't know what they want. I think it says a lot about Snufkin that his first instinct was to try and let them be free, and only when they said that they needed assistance did he enter a position of limited authority over them in order to help them learn to be free. This also overlaps very well with anarchist theory that places great emphasis on freedom being something that you learn and that goes hand in hand with your self-actualization as a person. An example of this is how anarchists view the concept of vanguard parties. Vanguardism is a theory popularized by Vladimir Lenin, who argues that due to the complexity of Marxism, a close-knit group must exist to protect the party from corruption and educate the proletariat, the working class. This theory is commonly rejected by anarchists, who view it as inherently hierarchical, undemocratic, and doomed to kneecap the revolution by forcing its potential into line with the vanguard's politics. Anarchists instead believe in a mix of direct action, show don't tell, and democratic bottom-up organization. Instead of seeing themselves as self-appointed leaders of the revolution, anarchists see themselves as equal members of the proletariat whose duty it is to share their knowledge. Kind of like Snufkin, who didn't assume a position over leadership over the kids and instead entered a position of teaching them how to be free. Network of small units. This point doesn't really apply to Snufkin because it's completely about how society is structured and not that much about how the individual operates. You could probably make a point that Moomin Valley is an anarchist or socialist society of some kind because they seem to have a complete lack of government except the cop and the park keeper, and they foster a culture of helping each other and a free exchange of people and goods. Like, there's a lot of people that just show up at the Moomin's house needing and getting help, but that's a different topic that's kind of divorced from Snuff. Self-determination. I think Snufkin's feelings about self-determination, both for himself and others, can be seen in episode 24. In episode 24, Snufkin is shown on his way back after having left Moomin Valley for the winter, as he does every year. This year, Snufkin is a bit late, and the episode centers on Moomin's anxieties about this and trying to figure out Snufkin's whereabouts. Around 3/4 of the way into the episode, Snufkin, on his way back, takes a break from his journey and sits down at a fire to rest when a small creature appears and introduces itself with a proclamation that it knows Snufkin. Snufkin invites the creature to sit by his fire, an offer the creature gladly accepts, and then the creature starts essentially fangirling about how it talked with Snufkin and sat at his fire, and how it had heard so much about Snufkin from other people telling stories. Snufkin isn't a fan of the idea that others might be telling stories about him and idolizing him. After some more fangirling by the creature, it asks Snufkin to give it a name. Snufkin is apprehensive. He needs to give it some thought because, in his words, a name is a very important thing. The creature, however, completely trusts Snufkin though, and proclaims that it would be easy for Snufkin because he knows everything. I find this interaction very interesting because it's a good reflection of stardom and the idolization of people. Snufkin's discomfort with being well known and having stories told about him caused not so much by the mortifying ordeal of being known, but more so by the constraints of being put on a pedestal. You can immediately see Snufkin trying to escape the box he's being put in by suggesting he's not gonna go to Moomin Valley this year after Tittywoo, the name the creature was eventually given, reveals that he knows where Snufkin is headed. The idolization of you by others prevents dynamic changes of yourself, and that is what Snufkin wants to avoid at all costs. Idolization isn't just about Snufkin though. That shit's a two-way street. As we all know, parasocial relationships exist. Tittywoo's obsession with Snufkin genuinely seems a bit unhealthy, and I think Snufkin's reaction has a bit of concern for Tittywoo as well. Tittywoo doesn't even have a name until he meets Snufkin, and I don't think it's ever said why Tittywoo held off on giving himself a name, but he delegates that task, the very important task of your own name, to somebody that he met 5 minutes ago in the fucking forest. Snufkin doesn't want to be put in a box, but Tittywoo is holding himself back from becoming his own person and taking agency over his own life. The complete idolization Tittywoo has for Snufkin prevents him from being able to develop as an individual, thus chaining both him and Snufkin to the idea of Snufkin he has in his head. To put it with Snufkin's words, you can't look up to people too much if you want to be yourself. One of the main reasons that I made this video was because I want Snufkin to be an anarchist. I am an anarchist myself, and I look for reflections of myself in the media that I enjoy. Sadly, I have never really been able to find actual arguments for Snufkin being an anarchist. All I ever found was like, oh, he took down a sign and he did crime, ooh, which by itself isn't inherently an anarchist thing, right? And my goal with this video was to provide like a solid foundation for other people to build arguments for or against Snufkin being an anarchist. I don't think that this video will convince everybody, but I do think that it gives a good baseline for further discussion. My personal conclusion is that while Snufkin is an anarchist, he isn't one in the way that we would typically think of it. I'm not sure if Snufkin would call himself an anarchist or know what a black bloc or who Bakunin or Kropotkin or whatever are, but he doesn't need to. The society he lives in doesn't call for anarchy to be the constant fight we know it as. Snufkin isn't an anarchist in the way we think of it as, because Snufkin is truly free in a society that allows him to be that. And the society that the Moomins and Snufkin inhabit could very well be called a utopia, and there are a lot of people that would like to live in Moomin Valley. Of course, though, we can't just teleport ourselves to the land of the Moomins, but we can work to make our world as similar to that utopia as we can. And one of the ways that we can do that is by looking at how the world we live in works, how the world they live in works, and trying to figure out how we can apply that to our world. And anarchism has always dealt with trying to achieve a better world, even if you don't experience it yourself. And one of the core ideas of anarchism has always been direct action, trying to achieve a better world by acting as if we already inhabit it and as if we were already free. Maybe through acting like Snufkin, through treating each other with kindness and patience and allowing ourselves and others to be free, we can change our world. And maybe, through acting like we already live in that perfect world, we can get one step closer to it. Hello, this is the unscripted end part of the video where I beg you for money. Yeah, I've been working on this stupid fucking video for like over a year now, and I've had so much shit happen. I moved out of the orphanage that I lived in. I now live in my own apartment. I had to buy the camera and the lights and the mic and all of that stupid bullshit. And so if you felt that this video provided some value to you, there's going to be a QR code or a link or something on screen right now and in the description, or you can throw like €1 or €2 or $1 or whatever my way. I will also be putting a link to a charity for Palestine in the description, and if you have the choice if you have the money available and you can only donate to one of those two things, you should donate to Palestine. Yeah. Hope you enjoyed the video. Goodbye. I'm done.